Thank you all for coming out. My name is Ryan Redman, and I'm the executive director of the Flourish Foundation. And on behalf of our entire organization, I just want to express our gratitude for being here. I know at the end of summer in Sun Valley, an evening is like gold, but I assure you that this will be a big gold nugget this evening, having this opportunity to listen to Thupten Jinpa. So before we start, I just want to express that Flourish, over the past few years, has had a really wonderful opportunity to bring in fantastic lectures into the community. And all of these have been free of charge. And there's so many people that are sitting out there tonight that have made this possible. And so I really want to acknowledge all of you. I fear if I were to try to list you by name, I know I would probably forget someone. But I want to highlight two individuals in particular that have really stepped up to support this talk. And first, I'd like to acknowledge my dear friend, Ann Down, who she always has the wonderful privilege of hosting these incredible speakers who are actually her very close personal friends. So I request that she will always continue sharing her Rolodex of remarkable people, and also just acknowledge your generosity in so many ways, not only with Flourish, but with so many organizations in the Valley. So thank you, Anne. And then my dear friend, Diane Nini, who had the vision of bringing this talk together in the spring, and through her willingness and generosity to move forward with this talk, it really stimulated or catalyzed the invitation to Jinpa. So I want to thank you to Diane. And Diane is now a facilitator in our organization, so she's been a continued supporter, but a wonderful contributor now in the classroom with the work that we do with the kids. So thank you, Diane. In the year 2000, I really became deeply inspired by meetings that I was starting to hear about that were taking place between renowned scientists and His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And through these meetings, there's been an incredible pollination of ideas that have really spurred entire fields of study and scientific research, but then also have really created a lot of momentum in academia around what is well-being. And since 1989, since the inception of these meetings, Thupten Jinpa has really served a kind of indispensable role as being a medium in these talks. And he's really done a beautiful job in melding the contemplative wisdom with the scientific wisdom. And in addition to that, he has also served as the primary translator for the Dalai Lama for the last 30 years. And with a degree in, an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a doctorate in comparative religion from Cambridge, and then he also has a Geshe degree from Gandhi University in southern India, he, I believe, has really blessed us all with clearly articulating the practical and profound wisdom of the Dalai Lama. And so it's truly extraordinary to have him here. And in so many ways, he continues this work as a translator, but also he's edited a number of books that His Holiness has written, books like The Universe in a Single Atom, Ethics for a New Millennium. And so he's really been kind of on the forefront of bringing these cultures together and really trying to find innovative ways to create this paradigm of well-being, not only in science, but also education, the environment, and also in relationship to the economy. And currently, Jinpa lives in Montreal with his wife, Sophie, and their two daughters. and he's an adjunct faculty member at McGill University. He's also the chairman of the Mind and Life organization, which has been fostering these dialogues with the Dalai Lama and scientists. And then he also serves as a research advisor or faculty researcher at the Institute of Neuroinnovation and Translational Neuroscience at Stanford University. So we are incredibly fortunate to have you with us. And tonight, Jinpa will be sharing his ideas on stretching the boundaries of science. And so if you would join me in giving Thupten Jinpa a warm Sun Valley welcome.
What I thought I would do in my talk is to really share with you my own personal excitement of having been part of this journey, part of this kind of, enterprise that Ryan talked about, how the meeting of science, scientific inquiry and research on the one side, and the insights and the wisdom and practices from the contemplative traditions on the other, have really kind of led to a kind of a new way of thinking about, human existence, human potentials, and so on. And, I've been part of this ongoing conversation, primarily because in my own capacity as the Dalai Lama's interpreter. His Holiness has been, a great advocate of this meeting of science and spirituality, and he genuinely believes that there could be a constructive way in which science can engage with spirituality. After all, whether it is science or whether it is spirituality, both of them are in the business of trying to understand the truth and search for truth, however way we may characterize that search. So characterize that truth. So in a broader sense, the kind of the driving force and the underlying motivation behind the movement of science and movement of spirituality really is a shared mission to seek truth. And both of them are driven by an attempt to seek the promotion of our well-being and search for happiness, however we may define it. So His Holiness has been a real advocate of this, and also His Holiness genuinely believes that modern science, which has been tremendously successful with uncovering layers and layers of the physical reality, from the macroscopic level of the cosmos, the origin of the cosmos, down to the microscopic level of atoms and particles, probably now can use the same kind of rigor and the method of inquiry and kind of meticulous approach to understanding the human mind and human condition. And he has been advocating this. And I remember at one of the Mind and Life conferences in Dharamsala, this was a dialogue that came out in the book called Destructive Emotions, which was edited by Daniel Goleman. And at one of those conversations, he threw a challenge to the scientists who were gathered there. He said, look, you scientists have been tremendously successful in mapping the pathologies of the human mind. You have, kind of huge number of taxonomies of the, how mind can go wrong, the diseases, mental illnesses, and so on. But you have done very little, if any, on trying to understand and map the positive qualities of the human mind. Why can't you do the same thing with the positive qualities of the human mind? What about compassion? What about empathy? What about, love? What about affection? And what about forgiveness? What about tolerance and patience? So he threw that challenge, and from that conversation emerged a kind of a motivation on the part of scientists like Richard Davidson and others who really took up that challenge. And these kind of movement have, of course, there are many other participants in this larger movement, but one very important force has been the Mind and Life Institute, which Ryan referred to, and I have currently the privilege of being the chair of this organization. And so, I have had this privilege to see how this conversation has unfolded and what kind of, insights it has led to, and what kind of, kind of new understandings of the human condition and human mind and possibilities of the human mind that it has really kind of led to. So these are things that I have had the privilege to see. What I thought I would share here would be maybe two things. One is, what this new conversation and the kind of, this conversation between science, and basically it's two disciplines which traditionally wouldn't be sitting down together, and how this kind of conversation has really led to a new way of thinking about science and its roles, particularly when it comes to understanding the human mind. And so I thought I could sort of focus on two areas. One is what this means in terms of having a new understanding of what exactly is the human nature, what is our fundamental nature. The other one is, how this kind of meeting and this kind of interface and integration of science and contemplative insights have really led to kind of a new way of understanding the processes and mechanisms of the brain that explains how personal transformations take place, particularly in response to our experience and in response to conscious thought processes like meditation and contemplative practices. So those are the two areas I will focus on, and I'll speak for about maybe 40 to 50 minutes, and then at the end, we will leave 20 to 30 minutes for a question and answer time. And I encourage all of you to take the opportunity to ask me questions, not necessarily anything to do with what I say. It could be on any topic that, if I have something to say, I'll respond. If I don't know, I will just say I don't know. It could be on my relationship with the Dalai Lama, what it feel like to translate work for him, or it could be about Tibet, or it could be about anything that is somehow related to my life, so please feel free. Now, the first area that I am particularly excited about is really how this kind of conversation can really have an impact on the scientific understanding of what human nature is. And this, it may seem like a kind of an abstract theoretical idea, but in the end, it isn't. Because one thing that we have to remember is ideas do matter. If you look at Western civilization, one of the great hallmark achievements of Western civilization has been the idea of individual liberty and the need for the collective society to accord some kind of respect and dignity to the individual. That has been a founding idea of the Western civilization in the modern times and what it has led to. So the ideas do really matter. And in the case of human nature, again, it is important because if you look at the current societal structure, whether it has to do with policies behind economy, or whether it has to do with the whole economic system, or whether it has to do with scientific explanation of human behavior, all of these enterprises presupposes a certain picture of what a human being is. And if you look at what that picture is currently, the dominant picture is, that story says that we are ultimately self-serving, competitive beings. That really is the story. That is based on the Darwinian evolutionary theory, as specially read by Thomas Huxley, and the idea that nature and human existence is like a gladiator's show where the strongest survive to fight for another day. That's exactly Huxley's words. And this is also the picture of human being, human nature, that underpins modern economic system. There's, in fact, according to economic theory, we are Homo economicus, and we are, basically profit maximizers. And that whole picture of human nature underpins the economic theory. And so the kind of conception of human nature we have really matters. Now, the interesting thing is that we're beginning to see a serious questioning of this picture. Although some scientists may argue that the opposite side, the kindness instinct, the cooperative behavior are kind of innate part of our nature, but at least a lot of scientists would agree that this selfish nature picture of human being is too simplistic. And in fact, the scientists themselves are beginning to understand that if you just take the selfish picture of human beings, it doesn't give you a full explanation of how complex levels of cooperation can take place. So there is now a serious discussion, even in economy, among the economists, of what role the nurturing part, the caring instinct, play in the human evolution of cooperation and so on. And some of these are, kind of revision and revisiting, rethinking of human nature is coming also from the study of non-human primates, looking at chimpanzees and their behavior. And scientists are beginning to recognize that there are, at a rudimentary level, similar types of moral sentiments like sense of fairness and empathy, even among animals. And there's, I don't know if any of you have seen this classic video from Frans de Waal, where there is a scene where two juvenile chimps get into fight, and one of them loses, and another juvenile chimp comes over and gives a hug and consoles that chimp. So there is this, empathy. And there is also another image where a bird falls down and gets injured, and chimp picks it up and goes to a higher place and tries to let the bird fly. So there are interesting discoveries coming from the non-human primate studies, and which really challenge this idea that selfishness and competitiveness are the only organizing fundamental principles. But the pervasive nature of this selfish human theory is very strong. I remember when I first came to Cambridge as a student. I was a monk, and I was in the philosophy department, and I remember having constant arguments with my philosophy student classmates, and about the reality of true altruism, and they would argue, and there was a sort of an understanding, and you can even find in writing, there was an understanding, especially among the more philosophically and scientifically educated people, that somehow when it comes to explaining human behavior, if you haven't found a self-interest involved in this, somehow you haven't found the ultimate explanation. So there was that kind of assumption that ultimately human behavior has to be explained in terms of self-interest. It has to do somewhere that there's a self-interest involved. And I remember citing the example of Mother Teresa, and one of my classmates said, even for Mother Teresa, there must be something in it for her, otherwise why would she do it? So, this was a very widespread kind of idea, and it still is to an extent. But now there is a beginning of a shift, and the shift is coming from many different directions. Some from the economics, some from the non-human primate studies, some from the new science of compassion, because increasingly we are beginning to recognize that nurturing instinct, which is very connected to our sense of affection and caring, plays a very powerful role in our motivation. So our motivation is not triggered just by self-interest, but it's also powerfully triggered by the caring instinct. So, and also the new research in the empathy is showing all of these. So all of this is beginning to question this kind of traditional view that we are self-serving, ultimately, competitive beings. So there is a recognition that just as self-interest motivation is fundamental to our nature, so is the caring instinct fundamental to our nature. So in some sense, we have two tracks. And similarly, just as competition is fundamental to explanation of human behavior and evolution of human behavior, similarly, cooperation is also equally powerfully explains human behavior and evolution. So there's a much more complex picture emerging. And so with this, there are also interesting studies that are done by scientists who try to study very young children to see how far can we observe altruistic tendencies in children, which is manifested in helping behavior. There's a team of 2 German scientists in Max Planck Institute. One is an anthropologist, the other one, and primate scientist. The other one is a child developmental scientist. And they collaborated and looked at children about 14 to 18 months old children. And the experiments are very cleverly designed. One of them involves an experimenter trying to hang a clothes, on a clothesline, and then accidentally drops a clothespin, and pretends can't reach it. And there's a child nearby, and the child instinctively gets up, picks it up, and gives it to the person. And it does it repeatedly. And then another scene is where there's an experimenter carrying a stack of magazine and goes and tries to put them inside a cupboard, but can't, open the cupboard, and tries to sort of become clumsy. And then a child gets up and opens the door so that the person can put those magazines in. But they found out that among the differences, for the 14-month-old children do not help in the second case, because it's too complicated. They have to understand that he wants to put the magazine inside this cupboard. But in the clothesline experiment, both 14-month-old and 18-month-old help. And they found out, in fact, if you reward, it hinders the spontaneous helping behavior. So the reward is even, counterproductive. And then another study that was done that Richie might have actually, who came here, a major participant in this larger contemplative science movement. Richie often cites this example of how 6-month-old babies in the New Haven area were done a research, and they, consistently showed that the children prefer watching, scenes where there's a helping behavior as opposed to hindering behavior. So there seems to be a kind of a natural bias towards helping and altruistic behavior in the early childhood. This is, so these kind of, findings and research, and from many different directions, as well as scientists and theoreticians coming into contact with, traditions like the Buddhism, where this idea that kindness and compassion is part of our instinctive, innate, character, is, very, very, present there. So all of these together are now beginning to change the way in which scientists are beginning to see maybe we got the wrong, at least the incomplete, if not wrong, incomplete picture of who we are. And this will have real implications, because if we don't get our picture of who we are correct, then the kind of societal structures we will build, will have implications. So this, I think, is an interesting one area which could have huge implications down the line. The other area is where the meeting of scientists and contemplative practice and insights have led to scientists having a greater opportunity to understand how brain changes and what are the processes and mechanisms by which brain changes in response to our experience. And this is coming through the collaboration of people like Richie, who's a neuroscientist, collaborating with people like Matthew Ricca, who's another colleague who has come here, who is a meditator and a Buddhist scholar, working closely together to see, and these the advantage of having trained meditators is that they have some degree of control over their mental processes so that they can use introspection in a much more disciplined manner. So these kind of collaborations are beginning to show how the scientists can actually study how brain changes in response to conscious thought processes. And this kind of collaboration is also taking place at a time when the neuroscience is in a very good place with the kind of, invention of new imaging technologies like fMRI. The neuroscience has a much more sophisticated technology now to look, deeply into the structure and functions of the brain, which in the past, maybe 20 years ago, it did not exist. So there is much more sophistication in the method that is possible. Similarly, the discovery of, brain plasticity has really, offered the conceptual language and the framework for neuroscientists to look at changes that are taking place in the brain in scientific terms. The contemplative traditions have been talking about personal transformation for thousands of years. But for the scientist, unless you have a way of measuring and talking in scientific language, none of these, other non-scientific languages really help. So the discovery of brain plasticity has really helped the science to have a handle on how do we understand that something like a mental thought processes like mindfulness is really actually shaping and changing the brain. So these kind of things have really kind of made this, the scientific approach and method to really kind of go quite far. Because in the end, even now, the scientific method really is a third-person method. Objectivity is the key hallmark of scientific approach. The scientific approach is to look at something from the outside. I mean, that's really the model. But what is happening is with this collaboration with the, contemplatives is offering science at least a way of bridging the first-person language, what it feels like to be in those kind of states, and a third-person approach of science, which looks at how does the brain look like when the meditator is X, Y, and Z states. So it's offering an opportunity to, make the two come closer. I mean, I don't know whether ultimately the science will ever come to the place where it will solve the ultimate question of what consciousness is. That I don't know. I'm more of a mysterist. Mysterism is a term borrowed from theology. In theology, there is a position with regard to the existence of divinity. So mysterism is a position which says, yes, we will never fully know the reality of the divinity. It's total mystery. So that's a mysterism. So a rationalist would believe that human mind would ultimately be able to, access the reality, existence of divinity. So, in consciousness studies, people borrow that term, and mysterism is a position which basically says that no matter how far science progresses, nature of consciousness may never be ultimately explained. So, but setting aside that question, there is a real possibility that through collaborations like this, scientific science will come ever closer to understanding the various, processes of the mind, whether it's emotion, thought, cognition, belief, whatever it is. There's a real possibility. And these things will have real implications. For example, one interesting recent discovery that has been made took place in Max Planck Institute through the collaboration of Tanya Singer, who is a German neuroscientist, and Matthew Ricard, who is a well-known Buddhist, French Buddhist monk. And in the new science of compassion and empathy, there is an understanding that empathy and compassion are different. But what they were trying to do is to tease out at the brain level whether they can find the brain signature when the person is just in empathy state, whether you can find a brain signature when the person is in compassionate state. And if you just ask someone, a naive subject, and ask them to now be in compassion or now be in empathy, you wouldn't have a clue. But an adept practitioners like Matthew Ricard, because of the training, is able to do it. So Matthew and Tanya collaborated, and Matthew spent hours and hours in the fMRI. And Tanya asked Matthew to just stay in empathy, think about the suffering. By showing an image, elicit an empathetic response, and just stay there. And then, just, look at the brain and try to understand it. And then at one point ask Matthew to now extend compassion, which is a wish to see that suffering be relieved. This is how, conceptually we distinguish between empathy. Empathy is a sort of a affective resonance, emotional resonance of what other person is feeling. But compassion is, in addition to this, you have some kind of wish to see that problem be relieved, situation be relieved. And Matthew says that, when he did the empathy practice, he said after a while, it gets really exhausting because you are in an emotional state. You are constantly resonating this emotion. And he was saying that it was exhausting. And when you are asked to do compassion, it's almost like a kind of a relief. And it's also a more empowered state because now you are wanting to see the relief of that situation, wanted to do something, and also the motor regions of the brain gets activated when you are in compassionate state. Now the implications of that is that often in the caring profession we talk about compassion burnout, a constant exposure to others' pain. Those who are looking after elderly parents know this. Those who have disabled children know this. Those who are in nursing profession and intensive care units, you know that from personal experience. A constant exposure to suffering. As human beings, we are emotional creatures, and we can only take it up to a point. So there is this, in the profession, there is a widespread problem of burnout, empathy or compassion fatigue. So what now people like Matthew are saying is that actually it's not compassion fatigue, it's empathy fatigue. Because when you are just in the empathy zone, you are in the emotional zone, that resonance and being in that emotional zone is very, very draining. Whereas if you're in the compassionate zone, then you have empowered yourself. You want to see the relief of that suffering. And this could have implications for the way in which we train healthcare professionals. So this is a real discovery. The kind of the theoretical formulations are there in the, in the earlier texts, but the neuroscientific, kind of delineations of the differences then can be operationalized, can have real life, impact. Similarly, extensive research has been done on mindfulness, and I know that here Ryan teaches mindfulness, and I met with a group of compassion leaders, high school students, and I have two daughters. My elder one is 17 and the younger one 15. So I told the compassion leader students here, you're very lucky. I wish my daughters could go to one of those groups. So mindfulness has been extensively studied. This is John Kabat-Zinn has been a major figure in this because of the development of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And increasingly what the research is showing is that part of the problem and heaviness of the stress and the pain that we experience as a result of stress really comes from not so much the situation itself that is causing us the stress, but our reaction, our response, and the tendency to cling on to it. Now, these ideas are there in the contemplative traditions, but until science comes to do a kind of a study, clinical study, and tease these out, it's very difficult to operationalize them and have an application that could be brought out into the larger world. Now, because of this kind of collaboration, there's a way in which these things could be studied, and then this has a real implications in everyday life. And so this would have implications for people who are doing therapy and stress reduction and so on. So these are, interesting, really discoveries. And the other one that is coming from the compassion science research is that and this is done by Nancy Eisenberg, she studied among children, why is it that some children, when they see another child in pain, experiences into a kind of a personal distress and gets kind of really stressed out. And some children respond and help the other child. So why is it that some children, as a result of their experience of empathy in the face of another child suffering, kind of becomes themselves distressed and becomes self-focused, while others reach out and help? So that was the big question that Nancy Eisenberg studied. And what she found was that among the children who are not able to regulate their emotion. So for example, when they get triggered by something, if they're not able to regulate that emotion, the distress they experience, they tend to turn inward to themselves. And even if they help, they would be helping the other child so that they don't have to experience the pain. Whereas children who are quite good at regulating their own emotion when they get agitated or when they are able to make themselves available to the other child and help. So this is again a fundamental difference. We are all same. We all have empathetic instincts. Some respond in one way, some respond in another way in the face of exactly the same situation. Again, teasing these out, really has implications down the line. So that's why teaching of social emotional learning in schools can have a huge implications. If the children, it's not only to protect the child from their own aggressive emotions, but also to allow the child to be able to regulate their emotions so that they can express their caring human instinct to others, which also has a huge implications for social relations and connections with others and so on. So these are important findings which have implications. Another thing that has discovered in the kind of science of compassion, which we are beginning to see, is that when we are able to relate to others from a compassionate instinct, it also puts us in a better mood. Now this is, if you think about it, it's actually kind of a little paradoxical, because compassion arises in response to someone's suffering. And when you experience compassion, you do also feel for that other person who is in need. And one would expect that it would dampen your mood and make you less positive. But it turns out it's the opposite. This is the research that I was involved in at Stanford. And what we did was we brought in undergraduates, and they had a simple instruction, say that when we ask you to extend compassion to this person, think of this person's pain and try to wish this person well. That was the instruction. And if we ask you to not extend compassion, just don't do anything. That was a simple instruction. Then the students were shown faces. These are stock images that come from psychology departments. Everywhere uses these. And their sad faces elicits compassion more easily. Neutral faces don't elicit compassion that easily. It's very, it's understandable. This is how human beings react in a normal situation, And so they were asked to, they were shown different phases, and for some phases they were asked to extend compassion. For some phases they were asked not to extend compassion, just stay neutral. So they did that a couple of times, and then they were, at the next round of experiments, and they were shown images of slides of modern painting, completely neutral images, which an average person wouldn't see any difference actually. And they were asked to rate 1 to 5 how much they liked it. But unknown to them, just before the image was shown, there was, for a fraction of a second, they were shown one of those faces. But it was shown so swiftly that they would have no way they would remember or recognize it, register it. Amazingly, the faces that were shown after, the images or paintings that were shown after the faces to which they have extended compassion, they rated them far more positively. So I mean, it's interesting, it is. So it shows that how, something like, and also we know, for example, like, one of the problems that we have in our own suffering is that we get so caught up in our own narrow cocoon of self-concern, and that narrowness really kind of enhances whatever problem we happen to be facing. And there is a Tibetan tradition of mind training where there is a beautiful imagery. It says that the more excessively self-preoccupied you are, you're putting the bigger target you are putting, so that you get easily hit from all kind of directions. So the more self-concerned and self-preoccupied we are, the more vulnerable we become to situations of hurt. And so on the contrary, if we think about all our experiences of greatest happiness, whatever it is, birth of a child, whatever it is, one common thread in all of this is in those moments we have managed to forget ourselves. So it's interesting. It's almost as if when we are self-conscious, self-focused, self comes in the way of our experience of happiness. So these are interesting findings beginning to be kind of shown through scientific experiments as well. So all of these, the interesting thing about these kind of work is they have real implications for the way in which we live. These are not abstract scientific experiments that have no relevance to how we as individuals live. And one of the interesting things about these kind of discoveries is that they also, kind of show us what is a more skillful way of living on a day-to-day basis. And it really makes us become active agents of our own well-being, so that we don't seek constantly someone else's help to have a. So I think these are interesting kind of, it's sort of a movement right now, but I think this is one of the common thread if you look at the movement of positive psychology, whether it is the movement of wellness, whether it is the new science of compassion. The common thread in all of these is birth of a new kind of knowledge which can be really acted on right now in our day-to-day life. And the good thing about all of these is that they make us live our life in a way that makes us more human, because we have kind of forgotten it actually as a society, because materially we have been very successful, particularly in the affluent parts of the world. As a society, we have lost kind of a cohesion that has traditionally offered because of a shared kind of religious belief systems. Now in the public domain, our shared culture is secular, and in this kind of culture we have kind of lost and what exactly is that we are looking for. We have come to define happiness in terms of material acquisition and in monetary terms, because that's easier. It's a sort of a metric that you can count and how you are performing well or not, how much you have, where you live. But in the process, we have actually forgotten that those things are actually means for offering us happiness. Those are not really the ends in themselves. So I think the new science that is coming out now, whether it's the science of wellness or science of compassion, are beginning to remind us that there is a different way of living. And also, they're reminding us that to a large extent, happiness or unhappiness is a really state of mind. It's not really, of course situations do matter. If you are living in an impoverished state with, nothing to eat, of course, then the first most urgent need is to get those material needs. But once you have gone beyond a certain level, then happiness and suffering is really determined by a particular kind of outlook that you have, the way you see the world, the way you see ourselves, and the way you relate to others, and the way you experience the world. And this is something that we have learned from the spiritual traditions, whether East or West. If you look at the common thread in all the great spiritual traditions, all of them tell us that the way we see ourselves and others determine the way we feel and experience ourselves and the world around us. And that determines how we behave in this world in relation to ourselves, to others, and the environment that we live in. And this is an ancient wisdom. And now we have a science that is increasingly showing us in that direction as well. So I, for one, am very excited to be part of this. I've had the privilege of being part of Mind and Life very closely, having had the opportunity to sit down and dialogue with many scientists, but also in my capacity as a research scholar at Stanford, I was part of a team that developed an 8-week compassion training program that has now been used in Stanford Medical School, among undergraduates, Google engineers, and there is a major healthcare center private healthcare group in San Diego with over around 20,000 employees that uses this 8-week training course as an in-house self-care human resource kind of a program. And so the same program has also been used at a residential treatment center for PTSD for vets in Palo Alto. So all of these are, and the good thing is all of these are programs that have been worked very closely with clinical scientists so that we have a way of operationalizing what exactly are we trying to, inculcate, what kind of mental state we are trying to induce, and what effects it might have in their person's relationship to themselves and their spouses and families. So I think it's an exciting time. I've been very fortunate to be part of this, and although I don't want to promote my own book, but I've just written a book that's coming out in March, where I've really tried to bring this point, and the subject matter in the introduction, I say that the subject matter of this book can be summed up in a very simple way. Basically, the book argues that caring and compassion are a very fundamental part of our natural instinct, and to embrace it and nurture them, and to really learn to live our life, to relate to ourselves. This is important because in contemporary world, many of us have real difficulty, being kind to ourselves. This is increasingly becoming very clear, particularly in the more affluent society. So if we are able to relate to ourselves, to others, especially our loved ones, and to the world from that point, from that place, this is the key to our own personal happiness as well as societal happiness as well. So that really sums up the message of that book. So and I've really been, had the privilege to really, as someone who worked very closely for His Holiness, to see in some sense from the front seat what it means to live from that kind of place in the person of the Dalai Lama. Here is an individual who embodies, what it means to be truly human. He carries the weight of the world, he cares for the world, but at the same time, at the personal level, he is a truly happy person. And that combination of deep caring, but also a profound joy, and with a tremendous sense of humor, and ability to relate to his own needs and situation with a lightness of touch, that I think is the secret of happiness. And I think there's nothing, as a Tibetan, of course, we see the Dalai Lama as manifestation of the Buddha of compassion, but on a conventional level, he's just another human being like us. We all have, and he is the one to remind us. He will be the first person to remind us. We are all same, and we have that capacity. And I feel that, of course, in today's world, when we look at the world around us, with the ISIS, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all this, the world seems to be almost in chaos. Talking about these things may seem almost like a luxury, but in the end, ultimately, if there is going to be a genuine peaceful coexistence and peace in the world, it has to start from each one of us. And hopefully, and this is one reason why I'm personally enthusiastic about working in North America, because America still is the sort of the light of the world, and much of the innovations in the world in the late 20th century and middle of the 20th century has really taken place in this nation. So something like this, kind of a new way of being in the world, taking compassion seriously, taking the role of mindfulness seriously, and bringing these in education, bringing these in the clinical setting, bringing these in economic relationships. If we are able to create a new model of how to live, it really has a chance that the others will follow. So I don't think it's a luxury to be thinking about these things. So from a long-term point of view, I genuinely believe that thinking about compassion, promoting it, really is the answer to many of the problems that we see in the world. Thank you.
Raise your hand and we'll hand you the mic.
Yeah, here.
What will be the name of your book?
Oh, thank you. It's called A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives and Ourselves. Yeah, it's in the process. It'll take a little while. Yes, there's over there, yeah.
Thank you. When you were talking about children not showing as much compassion when they were being acknowledged for their compassionate acts, do you recall when you spoke about that? When they were not necessarily rewarded, but they were acknowledged for
Yes,
it?
yes.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about that? And would you extrapolate that to higher ages? Because you said it was with younger children.
Yes, this is a very young age. It was 14 to 18 months old. And it seems, one of the researchers came to Stanford at one of the conferences on science of compassion and made the presentation, showed us the video. And his take was that when you reward them, it interrupts a kind of a natural instinct they have, and they get almost like a kind of a confused signal. And that's why, and then they repeated this experiment in many different settings, and again, the results was the same. If you reward, then the next time the child does not instinctively, help. Now, what would that mean in terms of older age? I don't know. I can tell you my own experience of bringing up two daughters. My wife she's French Canadian, she's not Tibetan, so we come from totally different culture. And she grew up at her home where chores need to be done, but there was a reward that went with it. And I said no to my wife. I said, look, I don't believe in this tit for tat. And if we're going to give money, we'll give pocket money, which is not attached to anything that they do. But for their chores, they will be expected to help. So we need to create an expectation of them, as they get older, to pitch in, because this is their family as well, And I said, I don't think it's a good idea. I said, I don't have any research to back this up, but my gut instinct makes me feel really uncomfortable that you tie up, you know, a particular chore with a reward. And that's how we did it. And then later when I saw that video, I thought, oh, maybe my instinct was right. I don't know, but for older age, I don't know.
Most of the world's large religions have, at least at their ideology core, the idea of nonviolence.
Yes.
Practitioners of those religions, of course, have had challenges, and Christianity and Islam certainly do today. But I can't think of too many situations where you know of a pillaging horde of Buddhists. But there's something going on in Myanmar that I don't understand. Buddhists and Muslims are struggling in a violent confrontation there. Do you have any comment about that?
Yes, actually it's a source of major concern for His Holiness. I remember he in fact wrote a letter to Aung San Suu Kyi, and when His Holiness met with Aung San Suu Kyi in person in London, he very explicitly brought that up. I think there is this general perception that somehow a religion like Buddhism is immune to the kind of violence in the name of religion that we have historically seen in other cases. I don't buy that argument. You know, if you look at human history, the content of the religion really doesn't influence the way in which emotionally people relate to their own tradition. So let me put it this way. Where there are conflicts in the name of religion, often it is the issue of identity. It's identity politics. And whether it is Christian Muslim, Hindu Muslim, now in Myanmar, Muslim and Buddhist, it is really a conflict of identity clashes. So the Buddhists, despite the fact their religion, their own faith, explicitly, advises them against violence. Killing is the first, avoidance of killing is the first, precept. Despite that, even monks are involved in inciting violence against Muslims, because what happens is identity and nationalism becomes a more powerful driving force. And then of course it gets justified in the name of protection of the Buddha Dharma and all the rest. So that comes after the fact. It's a really an excuse, but the primary driver really is identity. And this is what is happening in Myanmar. And some of the narratives, if you listen to the Buddhists, particularly the monks who are inciting, animosity towards the Muslim minority, some of these monks are quite articulate, and they cite the historical case of how Buddhism used to be all over the Central Asian area, where now it's predominantly Muslims. And in India, Buddhism was very widespread, but now gone. So they tell these kind of stories of historical perceived kind of persecution of the Buddhists, and they say if we don't stand up, if we don't become, if we don't stand firm, the same thing will happen here. It's a sort of an emotional story. So I just wish that the senior members of the monastic community there will take this seriously and rein in these more younger, articulate, because in the end, the masses will follow what the monastic community will advise. And unfortunately, right now, the voices of restraint doesn't seem to be that strong. And there might also be elements of the Burmese military government that sees kind of some benefits in keeping this conflict alive. So it's a very complicated situation. And we saw similar situations in Sri Lanka too. Monks were involved in the persecution of the minority Tamils.
First off, thank you so much for being here. What a blessing for all of us. Two-part question. On the studies on happiness, there's so many of those that have been done. And the idea of generosity being such a powerful tool
Yes.
for happiness. Is that true? And if so, do we know why that is such a powerful tool? And then the second thing, as His Holiness' translator, you've been so blessed to be so close to him in so many ways. Can you share what you've learned from him non-verbally, not the verbal translations?
Yes, yes, sure.
And maybe a story.
Sure. The first question, I think it's this is very interesting, because if you look at the teachings of the great traditions, in Christianity, charity is important. In Buddhist tradition, dana is the giving. In the Muslim tradition, it's zakat, which is a sort of alms giving. So you see that, in the Hinduism, giving is important. So there is this emphasis on giving and sharing. And now new science is beginning to show how the act of giving really promotes happiness. There was an interesting study done on young children. And the children were, encouraged kind of helping behavior and giving behavior. And other children were, as a comparison, encouraged to, spend money on themselves. And then they did the same thing with undergraduates. And so in the undergraduate study, it was a bit more interesting. One group was given money to buy something for their best friend or their mother or someone that they really care about. The one group was given that same amount of money to shop for themselves. And again, on the score of happiness, the one group where the act of giving was not for themselves but to someone else, they scored much higher. So there seems to be something about the act of giving to another person that makes that. Again, goes back to this idea that we are able, in those kind of situations, we're able to get out of ourselves. Often it is this self-obsessive, self-preoccupation that weighs us down. And I was talking to some neuroscientists, and they said that actually it makes sense. It says the brain is designed in such a way that it mulls over problems. And brain hates unresolved issues. So left on your own devices, your brain is going to think about what's wrong in your life. And this is one of the reasons why ruminations is a constant state of mind for many of us. And so that was the explanation. And I think it kind of makes sense. Whereas when we are able to help someone, when we are able to feel compassion for someone, love someone, it completely takes us out of that state of kind of ruminations. And this is what brings joy. And this is also one of the reasons why, mindfulness is proven to be quite powerful for people to help prevent depression relapse. Because one of the conditions that aggravate depression is constant rumination. And mindfulness gives people some skill to dispassionately observe what's going on in their mind and not get caught up in that story that you are telling of yourself. So I think it's probably the same kind of reason that in the act of giving, we are connecting with someone, we are getting out of ourselves, and that makes the act joyful. I think that's probably my explanation. As for what I learned from His Holiness, I don't know where to start. It's been almost 30 years. He is it would be nothing surprising to say he's an amazing man. But one thing that I have noticed in him quite early on is that he is tremendously at ease with himself. That quality of being at ease with oneself, there's a kind of a relaxedness, which is difficult to articulate other than just being at ease with oneself. There's a kind of a naturalness, there's a kind of a lightheartedness, and also that comes with spontaneity. I remember many, many years ago, this was in California, and I tell that story in the book. This was in Newport Beach. His Holiness was engaged in a couple of days of conference on Buddhism and psychotherapy. And at the residence where he was staying, outside there was a small group of people, and there was one man who looked really disturbed. He was shouting, the Dalai Lama, Dalai Lama. And His Holiness walked over to him. The security people were kind of a little apprehensive, but His Holiness just walked over to him because he felt the pain. And then this person who was kind of suicidal, suffering from suicidal thought, went on about the pointlessness of living. And His Holiness, listened to him, talked to him about, look, you could still do things, and maybe, there are people who would be sad if you go, and maybe you might be able to help others. Don't forget that your life is not just your own. There are others around you. Oh, no matter what, His Holiness said nothing, no effect at all. And then His Holiness just stopped and gave him a huge bear hug. The security people were all going like this, and the guy just broke down in tears and totally calmed down. So His Holiness he has this intuitive ability, because he's so natural, at ease with himself, which I think is a remarkable quality. It's very rare to see that kind of sense of ease. And someone of his stature, he doesn't take himself seriously. We often, people who are in position of some power, take themselves very seriously. The formalities, the etiquette, and His Holiness is just informal, sometimes almost to the extreme. When he went to see President Bush at White House once, he wore flip-flops, because monks normally wear flip-flops, unless you are, taking a train or somewhere. Normally in India, monks wear only flip-flops. The staff was all kind of nervous, and so this is interesting that he has this ability to take things very seriously, be fully engaged, but with that kind of lightheartedness, that kind of lightness of touch. So it's difficult to kind of really fully characterize. Yeah, it's been a real privilege for me. Yes.
When you talk about the brains and the science, all the different traditions talk about the brain, they don't have the mind.
Yes.
There's the mind, the brain.
Sure.
And they're all understood in different
Sure.
ways. And then there's intention.
Yes.
And this intention to be compassionate.
Yes.
It's kind of like it can be taught, but it's taught in experiential, like in meditation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Do you know what I'm
Sure.
saying?
Sure.
Or in
Sure.
being inspired
Yes.
by
Yes.
chanting or
Sure.
prayer. And can you talk a little bit about, is that part of the scientific, are the scientists starting to get in touch a bit with where this intention comes from? Because I don't think it comes from the ruminating brain.
No.
Yeah.
Well, actually, at this stage, the term intention is being used slightly differently between the contemplative traditions on one side and the scientist on the other. As I mentioned in one of the earlier remarks, that for science to study something, they need to have a handle on it. They need clarity of terms. They need some way of operationalizing it. They also need to have some way of developing a measure to figure out what it is. So scientists make a distinction between intention and motivation. Intentions are seen as more goal-oriented, and it's directed to a particular set of goals, whereas motivation is the underlying reasons that may not necessarily be conscious to the person, but that's what fires you to do something. So they do not use intention. I mean, there kind of overlaps, but the kind of intention that you are speaking is slightly different. But if you look at the contemplative teachings, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism, this may be my own personal kind of interpretation. I see the contemplative practices, there are a couple of things that are great gifts coming from the contemplative tradition. One is bringing conscious intention into one's life. This is, whether it's come from the Buddhists or Christianity or whatever it is. Then the other gift from contemplative tradition is the ability to bring greater self-awareness in what you do. Now, self-awareness, you cannot just fake it. It has to arise. Self-awareness is different from self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is kind of a consciousness of yourself as if looked from outside. That's why self-consciousness is sort of such a problem, because we are looking at ourselves as if judged by someone from outside. And that's why, we all know that at social gatherings, when we are self-conscious, we become completely uncomfortable. And as an interpreter, working for the Dalai, sometimes on a stage in front of thousands of people, I know the moment I'm self-conscious, things go wrong. Then you get nervous, then the whole cascade of things happen, and then you start worrying, and then you forget. Whereas if I completely forget myself, then things flow naturally. So self-consciousness and self-awareness are very different. Self-awareness is a quality that has to arise through a certain amount of cultivation, so that you are able to bring awareness in the moment of things happening. And this is why spiritual teaching is a powerful technique for catching yourself. So for example, when you get angry, if you have a tiny bit of spiritual or contemplative practice, you'll be able to catch yourself before you start screaming. So, and if you're even better, you catch even before you get angry. What are the triggers? You start getting agitated. So this is where the contemplative practice is powerful. You are able to push from behavioral expression to the actual explosion, from the explosion to the rising of the emotion, from the rising of the emotion to the beginnings of that emotion, then finally to the trigger. And this is the gift of contemplative practice. This does not happen naturally. We're not designed to be able to catch ourselves, when we get that angry, because emotions are there to protect us. Emotions are naturally evolved in dealing with our survival and our needs. But contemplative practice so self-awareness is another important gift of the contemplative tradition. The intention, self-awareness, and also one of the things that I believe, and I personally find the greatest gift of contemplative approach to life, is the ability to bring greater alignment between our deeper values and aspirations on the one hand, our desires, instinct, and action on the other. Generally, a lot of us are well-meaning people. There's a saying, road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we might have good values, but our instincts and desire drives us in a different direction. Whereas a contemplative practice, whatever tradition it may be, the greatest gift, for me at least, is the ability to bring greater alignment so that we don't feel torn between our values and highest aspirations on the one side and our desire, impulses, and action on the other. Thank you. Yeah.
So to follow up on the whole idea of the Miramar monks and this notion of mindfulness and the personalities that are driving their reaction.
Yes.
There's a point where I want a button to be pushed inside of me, where I know I'm not going to fall in that direction of being driven by my personality.
Yes.
Well, what you're suggesting with these monks is, even though they're trained, they're still subject to that. Is there ever a point when you're not?
I think so. I think it depends also on where you are. For example, like in that community, if you are surrounded by for example, the majority of the monks, I mean, you know, if you are surrounded in an environment where what you are emotionally feeling in relation to the conflict that is happening is aggravated by sharing the same kind of ideas among your peers, then the chances of their practice being able to exercise a restraint is going to be much weaker. So it's again, it's the sort of the peer pressure kind of, you know, peer experience as well. But I do believe that you can get to a point where this becomes possible. You know, there are stories of Tibetan monks, you know, who spent, you know, there's a story that His Holiness often tells. There was a monk who spent 18 years in prison. And, you know, his greatest fear was that he was going to lose compassion for his captors. So it is possible. But I mean, as human beings, we are very complex creatures. You know, we are susceptible to, you know, influences coming from many different directions. But the more you are able to ground yourself in your own values and aspiration, the stronger. And that's why in the Buddhist teachings, masters say that initially the best approach is environmental management. So avoid temptations and conditions that would trigger your negative reactions, and then train your mind. And then the greatest test is to be in the midst of all the chaos and still stand your ground. But that's an ideal. Yes.
In the Myanmar example, how do you add the competition of resources to the conflict?
I don't think competition of resources is an important factor there. I mean, although it may play a little bit at the local level, you know, in terms of economic opportunities as Myanmar opens up for tourism and shops and so on. But I think the larger cause really is this fear of kind of, you know, Islamics taking over and diluting the national identity of the Burmese as Buddhists. I think it's really identity. The Burmese, you know, Burma is a Buddhist tradition, Buddhist country, but there is a small minority of Muslims who have always lived there for a long time. But as a society, Burma hasn't figured out how to accommodate within a majority Buddhist society, a minority, you know, Muslim community within this. You know, India has succeeded. In India is majority Hindu and minority Muslims, and the way in which they did that is to be explicitly secular in its constitutional orientation, so that the public institutions will be completely secular, and then the religion is left to the individuals. And that way, the larger national narrative becomes secular and not slanted to any particular religion, and within which the minority can feel safe and majority can feel not threatened as well. Whereas Burma hasn't gone through this kind of transformation. And so as kind of the tight rule of the military junta opens up, you know, people's kind of buried frustrations and fears are beginning to have an opening to express. And then, for example, like the Balkans, you know, when there was a very strict regime, and in Yugoslavia, under the Tito, there was none of these national aspirations for independence and separateness. Once that lid was taken off, there was all these fights among the ethnics. It's about the identity. So the Burma is also ultimately is a challenge of majority Buddhist country, you know, finding a way in which they can accommodate minority Muslims within their fold. Yeah.
So if there was abundance of resources there, then you would say that there most likely would still be a conflict between
Yeah.
Muslims and
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I haven't read your book, but if you find this involved with what you've spoken about, the role discernment might play in the transformation of the mental concepts of mind to the spiritual value or evaluation. Is that something?
Discernment?
Discernment, yes.
Yeah, discernment. In the scientific literature, there isn't much discussion of this, but in the Buddhist tradition, discernment is the function of wisdom. And wisdom, for example, like wisdom is seen as an important complementary factor to directing compassion. So compassion on its own is not seen as complete. Compassion needs to go alongside with wisdom. And discernment is the way in which wisdom is expressed, the faculty of wisdom is expressed. So it plays a crucial role in the personal development and transformation.
One more question, please.
Okay.
Thank you. I just was curious to know that with all the experiments and all of the studies that you've done, if there was any difference between the feminine and the masculine brain.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I cannot really speak. It's obvious because I don't have any fancy slides to show you. One area where they have found differences between men and women is in the empathy research. And this is one area where, and it's an interesting experiment because what happens is that they do these, what they call economic cooperation games. And then, one of the players is asked to cheat in the cooperation game. And then at some point, the cheater gets punished in this game. And then you look at the brain of people who are, other participants and observers. And it turns out when a cheater gets punished, the reward centers of the brain lights up. So it's sort of obviously we take satisfaction in the fact that the one who is guilty is been given, been punished. There's a justice. Now here, both men and women are equal. Even in women, the reward centers of the brain gets activated. But interestingly, in women, the empathy centers of the brain gets activated too. So while feeling good that the deserving guilty person got punished, but there is also an element of sense of concern for what was done. And there men seem to be very different. Men seems to really probably just relish. So this is an interesting gender-based finding. And I'm sure there are others, probably, there might be some others, but I don't know. Okay, thank you.